An 84-year-old grazier in southeast Queensland spent 7 months believing he might lose the property he'd spent his life working over a patch of weeds he'd cleared with a small rubber-tracked loader. He'd checked with the relevant authorities before doing the work. He'd deliberately avoided every tree and every protected area on his land. And he still ended up facing a $1.2 million fine and a possible 25-year rehabilitation order that would have banned him from stocking that part of his own property for the rest of his life, and likely beyond it. Hit subscribe for more stories like this. The area in question was mapped under Queensland's property map of accessible vegetation in a zone known as Category X. Category X land is officially classified as Nen Remnant, meaning it isn't considered original, intact native vegetation, and landholders are generally permitted to manage it, including clearing timber, without needing a state permit. The grazier's target wasn't timber at all. It was lantana, an introduced shrub officially declared a weed of national significance, known for forming dense, impenetrable thickets that chock out native grasses, reduce grazing capacity, and are widely blamed by landholders and ecologists alike for degrading the very habitat some regulations are designed to protect. According to environmental consultant Stephen Cupit, who represented the grazier and later detailed the case publicly at a Property Rights Australia conference in Roma, the man was scrupulous about what he did and didn't touch. Other parts of his property held genuine areas of protected vegetation and known koala habitat, and he left those alone entirely. Even though his Category X designation would technically have permitted him to clear standing trees in the affected zone, including a dense population of forest bluegum running at roughly 80 trees per hectare, he didn't remove a single one. His entire interest was the lantana. The work itself involved using a positrack, a small compact loader, to push the weed infestations into burn piles, followed later by spot spraying any regrowth. Before he started, he did what any careful landholder would do. He sought advice from both state and local government representatives, and by Cupit's account, both confirmed that his Category X mapping meant he was clear to proceed. Weeks after the work was completed, the grazier received correspondence informing him he was under investigation for alleged illegal land clearing. The referral, ironically, had come from his own local council, the same body that had earlier told him it supported his clearing plans. Attached to the investigation were potential penalties that included a fine of up to $1.2 million and a rehabilitation order that could have run for 25 years, effectively locking him out of using that section of his own land for the remainder of his lifetime. Cupit didn't mince words about the toll this took. He described an 84-year-old man living under genuine daily stress for months, not knowing whether he was going to lose the ability to run his own property. When Commonwealth compliance officers and ecologists eventually visited to conduct a full inspection, counting trees and taking measurements across most of the land, Cupit says one officer told him that the entire property, an area of open, rolling hill country, qualified as koala habitat. When Cupit asked what that classification actually meant in practical terms for a grazier trying to maintain his own land, the response, in his account, was blunt. That wasn't the officer's problem to solve. The 7-month wait, what followed was 7 months of silence while the investigation ran its course. According to Cupit, the grazier lived with the uncertainty every single day, not knowing whether the outcome would end his ability to work the land he'd spent decades managing. When the response finally arrived, it stated simply that the Commonwealth would not be proceeding with the investigation. No detailed explanation was offered for why it had taken 7 months to reach that conclusion, something Cupit says he pushed back on directly at the time. The story didn't end cleanly there either. Cupit says he subsequently received correspondence suggesting the consulting ecologist would like the landholder to voluntarily place the entire property under koala habitat protection on top of everything the man had already been through. Cupit's written response, in his own words, was blunt enough that he never heard back on the matter again. Why this case struck a nerve. Cupit, an environmental consultant with more than 3 decades of experience navigating vegetation law in Queensland, told the Roma conference that landholders are now dealing with 3 separate tiers of government regulation simultaneously: state, federal, and in some cases local, each operating with its own rules, its own definitions, and often no coordination between them. He described some local councils using a specific workaround to effectively override state-level Category X approvals, reporting routine, legally permitted clearing work directly to the federal government as suspected illegal land clearing. Once that referral is made, Cupit says the Commonwealth is obligated to investigate, regardless of whether the underlying claim actually has merit. He was direct about how much harder the regulatory landscape has become, even for someone with his level of experience. He described spending 2 to 3 hours most days simply trying to keep up with changes across different government websites, adding that the legislation itself can shift from one day to the next, making it genuinely difficult for any working landholder to stay confidently compliant without professional help. Queensland's local government minister, Anne Leahy, responded publicly to concerns raised at the same conference, stating plainly that councils shouldn't be operating beyond their intended remit and that her department has the ability to audit whether local authorities are staying within the bounds of state legislation rather than exceeding it. What Cupid now tells every landholder. Since handling the case, Cupid's central piece of advice to landholders is simple and consistent. Document everything. Record who you spoke to, when, and get their name. Get any approval or advice in writing, or ask directly if you can record the conversation. Photograph vegetation before any clearing work begins, using an app that embeds the time, date, and GPS location directly into the image, since an undated, unlocated photo can be dismissed as having been taken anywhere, at any time. The case never resulted in a fine. The lantana was cleared, the trees were left standing, and the investigation was ultimately dropped without penalty. But for 7 months, an 84-year-old man who did everything BYTHE book, who checked with 2 levels of government before lifting a single blade of his equipment, didn't know whether the property he'd spent his life on was still legally his to work.